Samuel Holt was 36 years old when the process server came through the cemetery gate. The burial had just ended. The last of the guests were still finding their cars. His father's casket had been lowered into November ground at Rolling Hill Cemetery in Charlotte 20 minutes prior, and Samuel was still standing at the edge of the grave, coat dark, roses in his left hand, doing the interior arithmetic of a loss that has no clean resolution, when the man in the gray jacket approached from the east path, said his name and handed him an envelope. His wife Camille was standing 15 feet away. She did not move toward him. She already knew what the envelope contained. To the people in their South Charlotte neighborhood, Samuel Holt was the electrician. He drove a work truck with his father's company name on the panel. He wore steel-toed boots to social events out of habit. He was modest about money the way working men are modest, not performing modesty, simply inhabiting it. Camille's mother had called him salt of the earth at their engagement party, and the phrase had landed the way such phrases land when they mean something other than what they say. What Camille had spent 8 months calculating around without ever looking directly at was that Charles Holt, electrician, had spent 35 years buying commercial real estate, one quiet parcel at a time, that the trust he established 15 years prior named Samuel as sole beneficiary, that it predated the marriage by 9 full years, and that it was worth $8.7 million. She had served him papers at his father's grave over assets she had no legal claim to. What happened next would cost Camille everything she had timed so carefully. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The house on Morrow Lane had been in the Holt name since 1973, when Charles Holt purchased it the year he started his electrical contracting business with $200, a borrowed truck, and the kind of relentless focus that did not require an audience to sustain itself. It was a craftsman bungalow, well-maintained, with crown molding he had added himself in 1987, and electrical work throughout that was flawless in the specific way of a man for whom quality was personal rather than professional. Samuel had grown up in that house. He had learned to read a circuit schematic before he learned to drive. When his father's decline accelerated beyond what the hospice nurses projected, Samuel moved back into the room he had grown up in, without discussion, without ceremony, because that was what you did. He was a licensed master electrician with 20 certifications and a reputation in the commercial sector for precision work that other contractors called him to consult on when the specifications got complicated. He ran field operations for Holt Electrical Services, the company his father had built over 40 years and never renamed. He drove the same work truck Charles had driven for 16 years. It had more than 200,000 miles on it. He had never seen a reason to change it. His mother, May Holt, had died of cancer when Samuel was 12 years old. She had been a fourth-grade teacher, patient and undeceivable, and her absence had shaped his father in ways that Charles never articulated directly, but that Samuel understood through how Charles moved, with the sustained attentiveness of a man who had learned that people were temporary and what you built in their name was not. Charles had told Samuel once, when he was 18 and impatient about the pace of things, "What you build in the dark matters more than what you show in the light. Build it right and it will introduce itself when it's ready." Samuel had held that sentence for 18 years. He had built accordingly. Aunt Louise, Charles's younger sister, 67 years old, a retired registered nurse who lived 4 blocks from Morrow Lane, had been present for most of the hospice evenings. She made soup that nobody asked for and stayed until Charles fell asleep, and sometimes well after. She had known Camille for 5 of the 6 years of the marriage and had said to Samuel in year 2, in a voice calibrated so only he could hear it, "That woman is always calculating something, baby. I just haven't worked out what." He had told her she was being uncharitable. She had nodded in the way of a woman who was confident in her reading of people and willing to wait for the proof. Samuel and Camille had met at a Charlotte Urban Land Institute event 6 years prior. He had been on a small business contractor panel. She had come up afterward with 2 business cards and a directness he had taken, at the time, to be genuine interest. He had mistaken precision for depth. He had learned the difference slowly, in the way men learn things they would rather not know, by accumulating evidence that cannot be dismissed and eventually no longer can be filed away. In the final week of his father's life, Camille had asked the hospice administrator in Samuel's presence whether there was a standard administrative timeline for estate proceedings following a passing. The administrator had answered with the neutral professionalism of someone trained to handle unexpected questions without reaction. Samuel had stood in the doorway of his father's room and heard the question and said nothing about it. He had said nothing about a great many things in 6 years. Charles's attorney, Douglas Fenwick, called Samuel the afternoon after the burial and asked him to come in Thursday morning. "There are things your father wanted you to know," Fenwick said. He did not specify. Samuel had assumed the estate was modest. The tools, the company assets, the house on Morrow Lane. He had not asked for details because it had not felt like the moment to be thinking about it. He drove home from the cemetery with the divorce envelope on the passenger seat. He did not open it until he was parked in the drive. He did not call Camille when he read what was inside. He did not call her attorney. He set the papers on the kitchen table of the house on Morrow Lane and sat with the information for exactly as long as it took him to decide what the situation required. Then he went to work. 12 years of commercial electrical work had taught Samuel that the visible problem was rarely the whole problem. Blown fuses, tripped breakers, flickering lights. These were symptoms, not sources. The source was always upstream in the wiring you couldn't see from where you were standing. And the only way to find it was to trace the circuit from the beginning and follow every connection without skipping ahead. He opened the shared tablet, the one they had both used for grocery lists and the occasional news article, the one Camille had left on the kitchen counter during her second hospice visit and not retrieved. He had no particular expectation when he opened the browser history. He found what he was looking for within 40 minutes. The search strings went back 7 months. They were specific and sequential. North Carolina inheritance as marital property. Divorce filing before estate disbursement. Timing divorce to maximize inheritance claim. Irrevocable trust versus marital estate NC law. The earliest search was dated the same week Charles had received his terminal diagnosis. His hands didn't shake. He photographed every screen. He documented each search string and its date. He went back further. The pattern was there with the same legibility as a circuit diagram to a man trained to read them. The searches began with general estate law questions and narrowed, over 7 months, into the specific strategy of filing before disbursement to assert a claim on anticipated inheritance. His face remained perfectly still. He opened the shared calendar, still accessible because she had not thought to restrict it after beginning her separate planning. He went back 8 months, 4 appointments listed as lunch meetings at locations that did not correspond to her work district. He cross-referenced 2 of the addresses against public directories. Both were Charlotte family law practices with specializations in high-asset matrimonial proceedings. She had consulted 3 attorneys in 4 months. She had also scheduled 6 weeks prior an appointment with a commercial asset valuation firm, the kind that worked primarily for divorce proceedings, listed in her calendar simply as a financial consultation. She had been working from a map. The map was wrong, but she had been building from it for 8 months. He pulled their joint savings account. $22,000 had been withdrawn in increments of $1,500 to $3,000. Over the previous 6 months, each transaction categorized as household expenses. The total was not the entirety of her preparation, but it was part of the record. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. He called Douglas Fenwick. The attorney answered on the second ring. Samuel told him he had been served at the cemetery. Then he asked directly whether any filing made in the 48 hours following his father's death could reach the trust assets. There was a measured pause. "Samuel," Fenwick said, "your father was a thorough man. He spent considerable time with me over the last 2 years making certain that specific things were structured in a specific way. I cannot give you the full picture by phone." Another pause. "But I will tell you this. Come Thursday, everything your father wanted you to know will be in that room." He thought about this. He thought about a great many things. He looked at the kitchen, the same kitchen from his childhood, the crown molding his father had installed at 42 years old, with a level and a patience that Samuel had always attributed to character, and now understood was also architecture. He opened a new folder on his laptop. He named it November 21st, the date of the attorney appointment, the date his father had been pointing him toward for 2 years. He called Patricia Odom and told her to clear her Thursday morning. Patricia Odom had practiced family law in Charlotte for 22 years from a Dilworth office, and she had developed, across those years, the professional ability to hear a situation described and identify its components faster than the person describing it had assembled them. She reviewed the divorce filing, the tablet search history photographs, the calendar documentation, and the joint account records across the top of her conference table without interrupting. She timed the filing to precede the estate reading. She said, it was not a question. By 48 hours. She believed filing while assets were still in transition might give her a claim. That is what I concluded. I want to be clear about one thing before we proceed. What she did at the cemetery is irrelevant to the legal outcome. It matters personally, and I want you to know I understand how it matters personally, but it does not change our posture. She folded her hands. What changes our posture is whatever Douglas Fenwick is going to tell you Thursday morning. I know Douglas. I have worked against him twice. He is meticulous. If he called you and said to come Thursday, there is a reason. She paused. Tell him I'm your counsel. He'll accommodate it. She had confirmed what he had already concluded. He had needed to hear it from someone who examined the paperwork without a stake in his father's memory and arrived at the same place. He had built it right. It would introduce itself. He drove to Aunt Louise's house on Wednesday morning. She was at the door before he knocked. She had coffee made and a chair pulled out and no patience for preamble. I knew that woman was calculating something from the day I met her, she said. I told Charles. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Your daddy heard me. Samuel looked up. She was quiet for a moment, with the expression of someone deciding whether the time for a thing had arrived. Your father knew about the attorney consultation, she said. I found out in September, and I told him. He didn't say much. You know how he was. He just went quiet in that way he had. Then he called Douglas Fenwick the next morning. She set her mug down. He had already been working on the trust structure for 2 years, but after September he added something. He told me he wanted to make sure what he had built could not be touched by someone who hadn't earned the right to touch it. Samuel sat with that for a long moment. He knew, he said. He knew, Louise said, and he handled it the way he handled everything. She looked at her nephew steadily, like a man who had already run the wire before anyone else knew there was going to be a wall. What you build in the dark matters more than what you show in the light. Patricia Odom called Samuel on Wednesday evening after reviewing the preliminary trust summary Douglas Fenwick had shared with her as his counsel. She delivered information the way she always delivered information, cleanly, without ornamentation. Samuel, she said, your father was thorough in a way I want you to understand before you walk into that room tomorrow. There is also a letter, sealed. Douglas said it reads as part of the trust proceedings. She paused. Come ready. He went to their shared home that evening to collect what he needed. Camille was there. She had been crying or had prepared to appear as though she had been, and she said his name when he came through the door in a tone calibrated to suggest she had been waiting to apologize. He moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of a man completing a task that required no conversation. He gathered what he came for. He answered her direct questions with single, accurate sentences. He did not argue, raise his voice, or express anything that would later require justification. When he left, she was standing in the kitchen with both hands flat on the counter and the expression of a woman who had expected a different response and did not know what to do with the one she had received. He drove back to Morrow Lane. He laid his father's tools out on the workbench in the order Charles had always kept them. Left to right, largest to smallest. Each one returned to its position regardless of how the day had gone, because a tool in its place was ready for the next use. He worked through the set until everything was positioned correctly. Then he made coffee and sat in the kitchen in the November dark and felt the quiet of a house his father had kept for 50 years. Preparation was not only work. Sometimes it was love made operational. Douglas Fenwick's office was on the 8th floor of an uptown Charlotte building that Holt Electrical Services had wired on a commercial contract 11 years prior. The certificates behind the reception desk were equally unhurried about updating themselves. Fenwick himself was 68, silver-haired, and operated with the measured deliberateness of a man who understood that every word in a room like this was load-bearing. He had called Camille's attorney the evening prior, at Samuel's instruction, and extended a professional invitation to attend the trust reading. The attorney, Jeffrey Slade, 45, 2 prior matrimonial wins in high-asset proceedings, had accepted. He arrived with his leather portfolio and the expression of a man who expected to be productive. They arrived together. Camille wore the same composure she had worn at the cemetery, contained, dressed for a professional proceeding rather than a bereavement. Samuel was already seated. Patricia Odom sat to his right. The room did not exchange pleasantries. Fenwick set the document on the table and looked at the room over his reading glasses. Charles Holt established this trust 15 years ago, he began. It is an irrevocable family trust naming Samuel David Holt as sole beneficiary. Irrevocable means it cannot be modified, challenged, or made subject to claim by any external party as a function of the beneficiary's personal circumstances, including marital status or active divorce proceedings. He paused, looking at Slade with the even calm of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where people needed to hear things they had not prepared for. I want that element stated clearly before we proceed to the asset summary. Slade had not yet opened his portfolio. Fenwick read the asset summary without haste. 11 commercial properties across Charlotte and the Raleigh-Durham corridor. Investment accounts in 3 institutions, a development partnership with Charlotte area builders that Charles had held for 12 years, the family home on Morrow Lane. Total trust value at the most recent independent appraisal, $8.7 million. Camille looked at the document. She looked at Slade. Slade was looking at the asset summary with the expression of a man recalibrating a set of assumptions he had believed to be sound. Because the trust predates the marriage by 9 years, Fenwick continued, and because all assets were placed into the trust prior to the marriage and have remained continuously therein, they are classified under North Carolina law as separate property in their entirety and are not subject to equitable distribution. He turned a page. There is additionally a provision Charles added to the trust in October of this year, 2 months before his passing. The room was very quiet. The provision states that the trustee is required to document and disclose any evidence of bad faith timing in divorce proceedings initiated within 24 months of the grantor's death. Specifically, evidence that a filing was timed to coincide with estate disbursement as a strategy to assert a claim on trust assets. He looked up. As Samuel's counsel has provided documentation of internet research history, legal consultation records, and financial preparation activity beginning 8 months prior to today's date, activity aligning precisely with the date of Charles Holt's terminal diagnosis. I am required under the terms of this trust to enter that documentation into the formal record of these proceedings. Slade set his pen on the table. He did not pick it up again. Camille's composure had been excellent. It had held through the asset summary. It had held through the separate property classification. It did not hold through the bad faith provision. Something moved across her face that was not grief and was not anger. It was the expression of a person who has understood in a single moment that the thing she spent 8 months engineering had been seen the entire time. There is one final element, Fenwick said. He produced a sealed envelope and set it in the center of the table. A letter from Charles. He asked that it be read as part of these proceedings aloud, in the presence of all parties. He opened the envelope. He read. Charles Holt had not written a long letter. He had been an electrician for 40 years, a man of precision and economy, and his final communication to his son ran to 3 paragraphs. The first confirmed his love. The second confirmed his intentions for the trust and what he hoped Samuel would build with what he had been given. The third was brief. I saw what was being planned. I didn't tell you because you didn't need that weight while I was still here. I handled it the way I always handled things. Quietly, in advance, before anyone else knew there was going to be a problem. That is what fathers are for. You build right, son. You always have. The room was still in the way that rooms are still when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Samuel pressed his thumb flat against the table's surface. He held it there for a moment. Then he looked at Camille with the measured, final attention of a man assessing a completed job, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the clear and uncomplicated knowledge that the work was done. She calculated everything, he said quietly, except what he had already built to hold it. He stood. He buttoned his coat. He shook Douglas Fenwick's hand and held it a beat longer than a standard professional exchange. He thanked Patricia Odom. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. Behind him, on the 8th floor of a building his father's company had wired 11 years ago, the room was left with the paperwork in the silence, and a letter from a man who had run the wire before anyone knew there was going to be a wall. 14 months passed with a steady, unspectacular forward motion of a well-wired circuit. No drama, no interruption, current moving exactly where it was directed. Samuel stood in the kitchen of the house on Morrow Lane on a Saturday morning in January, running coffee through a press his father had used every morning for 19 years and that Samuel had quietly claimed as his own. The crown molding from 1987 was in good repair. The circuit panel had been upgraded by his father's hands the previous spring and was correctly labeled throughout. Samuel had walked every room in the months after taking full possession of the estate and found nothing Charles had left unfinished. He had moved in permanently in March. The trust had been administered cleanly and without successful contest. Slade had advised Camille, according to the account that reached Samuel through Patricia Odom, that challenging the trust structure was a losing effort in every particular, and that the bad faith documentation added a dimension that any further proceedings would only worsen. The divorce had finalized in May. The settlement was modest, the joint account balance divided evenly, and the personal property from their shared home, cataloged and separated without drama. Camille had relocated to a position at a commercial real estate firm in Raleigh. Patricia Odom had heard through a professional contact that Jeffrey Slade had declined to represent her in subsequent matters, citing scheduling conflicts that were almost certainly not scheduling conflicts. A woman named Yolanda had been in Samuel's life since September. She was a structural engineer he had met on a commercial rehabilitation project in uptown Charlotte. A woman who talked about buildings with the same attention to integrity that Samuel brought to electrical systems, which was to say she was interested in whether things were built to last and indifferent to whether they looked impressive while falling apart. She had met Aunt Louise in October. Louise had told Samuel afterward, in private, with the full satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting a long time to deliver a verdict. That one sees you, baby. The whole of you. He had let that sentence settle into the place where things that were true and needed no immediate response went to live. He poured coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard where his father had grown tomatoes every summer, and the soil was still good. He would plant in the spring. He had already ordered the seeds. He had 11 commercial properties and an investment portfolio and a company his father had built over 40 years and never renamed. He had a house on Morrow Lane with crown molding from 1987 and a circuit panel upgraded with his father's hands. He had a letter sealed in Douglas Fenwick's safe that he could read whenever he needed to be reminded that the people who loved you could see farther down the road than you ever knew. He had built everything worth keeping. He had been given the rest. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.